My stepmother kicked me out with my newborn. Years later they needed my son. 16 years after my stepmother set a diaper bag on the porch and turned the deadbolt, while I was still bleeding through the pad the hospital sends you home with, she called my office 4 times in one afternoon. Every voicemail ended with the same 6 words. We need to talk about Eli. I didn't call her back that day. I sat in my car in the parking garage of the hospital where I've worked for 11 years, badge still clipped to my scrub top, and I listened to all 4 messages twice because in my line of work, I've learned exactly how fast people get polite when they need something only you can give them. Here's what I already knew, sitting in that garage. The reason my stepmother suddenly remembered my son's name had nothing to do with love. Here's what I didn't know yet, the part that would take me 2 more weeks and 1 lab report to understand. The thing she needed from Eli was about to prove something about him that unraveled every story that family had ever told about who he was and who he wasn't. Why now, after 15 years of silence? Why him? Out of everyone they could have called. And what didn't Celeste Fenwick know, dialing my number 4 times in one afternoon, that I had already started to figure out? Welcome back. If you've ever built a family out of the people who actually showed up, instead of the ones who were supposed to, this one's for you. Stay to the end, because the calmest part of the story is also the most dangerous, and it starts with a boy who was never supposed to matter, holding the one thing that mattered more than anyone in that family wanted to admit. I grew up in Millhaven, Ohio, 2 blocks from Fenwick Hardware and Feed, the store my grandfather built and my father ran after him. My mother, Patricia, died when I was 8. Ovarian cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the funeral home on Route 9. I remember the casseroles, more than I remember the service. 2 years later, my father married Celeste, who taught 3rd grade and sat on the deacon board at First Baptist, and who was never cruel to me in front of witnesses. That was never her style. Her style was smaller than that. When I was 11, she started buying 2 of everything for the family and 1 of nothing for me, and calling it fair, since I was, in her words, already so grown up and responsible. When Holden was born the following spring, I understood before anyone explained it that the math in that house had changed permanently. Holden was hers. Holden was theirs. I was the daughter who came with the house, the way you inherit a leaky roof along with the property. I want to be fair to my father, because none of this makes sense unless I am. Warren Fenwick was not a cruel man. He was a tired one. He worked 6 days a week at that store, and every decision Celeste made about our house, he let her make, the way water lets a riverbed decide where it goes. I don't think he told her no about anything involving me. Not once in 18 years. By high school, the pattern had a shape everybody in that house understood without saying it out loud. Holden got a truck for his 16th birthday. I got a bus pass and a job bagging groceries. Holden's baseball tournaments got the family calendar built around them, hotel rooms booked 2 months out. Celeste in the stands in a monogrammed Fenwick baseball hoodie. When I made the honor roll 3 years running, nobody mentioned it at dinner. I tell you all this not so you'll feel sorry for a teenager who got fewer birthday presents. I tell you because it matters for what happened when I was 19, in my first year of the nursing program, when I found out I was pregnant. The father was a boy named Caleb, sweet and aimless, who panicked the way 19-year-olds panic and moved to his uncle's place in Texas 3 weeks after I told him. I've made peace with that part. He was never built for the year I was about to live through, and there was no villain in it. Just a boy who left, and a girl who didn't have the luxury of leaving anything because there wasn't anywhere else for me to go. When I told my father and Celeste, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday in October, Celeste didn't yell. She never yelled. She set down the dish towel she was holding, the same gesture she used for bad grades and broken plates alike, and said, "Well, that's certainly going to complicate Holden's signing day." Holden was 17 that fall, being recruited for baseball, and Celeste had been color coordinating banquet centerpieces since August for the ceremony, where 3 colleges were sending scouts. My pregnancy wasn't a family crisis in her accounting. It was a scheduling conflict, landing 3 months before the biggest day of her actual son's life. I stayed in that house through the pregnancy because I genuinely had nowhere else to be, 19 and pregnant in Millhaven. Celeste's rule, stated once and never repeated, because nothing in that house ever needed repeating twice, was that I would not attend the signing ceremony showing and would not discuss any of it with anyone from the church directory. I kept both rules. I went to night classes until I couldn't fit behind the lab tables anymore, then worked the hospital intake desk 3 nights a week until 6 weeks before my due date, because we needed the money and nobody in that house was handing me any. Eli was born on the 9th of April, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with my mother's chin, which I didn't even know I remembered until I saw it on him. I was in the hospital 2 nights. Nobody from my family visited. My father sent a text that said, "Congratulations. Hope you're doing okay," which remains, to this day, the entire written record of his reaction to becoming a grandfather. I came home on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days postpartum, moving like something had been surgically rearranged inside me, because it had. It was raining, the thin gray kind Ohio doesn't bother announcing. I had Eli in the car seat, a hospital bag, and a body that hurt in ways nobody warns you about. My key didn't work in the front door. I'll describe this plainly, because plainly is worse than anything dramatic I could tell you. On the porch, beside the mat, was my old duffel bag, packed with most of my clothes. Beside it, a diaper bag I didn't recognize, stocked with formula and diapers a size too big for a newborn, like she grabbed the first box off the shelf. Tucked in the front pocket was an envelope, $200 in 20s, and a post-it in Celeste's tidy teacher's handwriting. "This is not our problem to fix. Figure out your next steps. We wish you both well." I called my father's cell 6 times, standing on that porch in the rain with a 3-day-old against my chest, and he didn't pick up once. I learned later he was 30 feet away at the kitchen table, and that Celeste had told him what she told him about everything for 18 years, that it was handled, that getting involved would only make it harder for everyone. And my father, tired man that he was, believed her the way he believed her since I was 10. I didn't have a next step. I had a car with a quarter tank, a phone at 9%, and a son wrapped in a thin green flannel blanket with a duck print, the kind the hospital sends every baby home in, the one still folded in a drawer in Eli's room today. The only person I could think to call, sitting in that car with the engine running for the heat, was a woman named Lou Bennett. Lou had been the charge nurse who trained me during clinical rotations, blunt and silver-haired, the kind of woman who ran a spare bedroom like an unofficial halfway point for young women the world had briefly given up on. She heard 4 sentences and said, "Come to the house, I'll leave the porch light on," before I'd even finished explaining. That porch light is the second image from that week I never let myself forget. One porch, locked and dark, with a note about a problem nobody asked if I wanted solved. One porch, 30 minutes later, lit up yellow in the rain, door already open. I lived in Lou's spare room for 14 months. She taught me how to bathe a newborn one-handed while exhaustion pulled at you from every direction, how to study for a pharmacology exam with a baby monitor propped against the textbook, how to make $50 of groceries last 9 days. She never once asked me to be grateful. She just made room. The way you make room on a shelf for a book you already know you'll want later. I finished the nursing program the spring Eli turned 2, walking across a stage in borrowed heels with Lou in the 3rd row holding my son on her lap, clapping loud enough that 3 people turned around. My family didn't come. My father sent a card. Celeste didn't. Holden, 20 by then, already working full-time at the store his father was slowly handing him, never once asked to meet his nephew. I worked nights on a pediatric floor for 3 years, took every hematology and oncology course the hospital offered because the kids on that unit were the ones who followed me home. I went back for my nurse practitioner license the year Eli started kindergarten, studying most nights after he was asleep, at Lou's kitchen table, the same table where she'd once shown me how to mix formula one-handed. By the time Eli was 10, I had my own apartment, my own name on the lease, and a job as a nurse practitioner on the pediatric hematology and oncology service at Ridgeline Children's Hospital, 40 minutes from Millhaven, close enough I never had to explain myself to anyone from that town again, far enough nobody had reason to. Eli grew into a quiet, curious kid who liked taking things apart to see how the insides worked, who kept a stack of library books about the human body on his nightstand before he could pronounce half the words in them, and who still, 12 years old and thoroughly embarrassed about it, slept with the corner of a certain green flannel blanket tucked under his pillow where his friends couldn't see it. I never told him the details of the night we left Millhaven. He knew, in the outline a kid needs, that my family and I didn't speak, and that none of it was ever, for one single day, his to carry. I said that sentence to him so many times over so many years that it stopped being something I told him and became something he simply believed about himself, which I count as the single best thing I've ever built, better than any promotion, better than any degree. By 14, he gotten interested in genetics for a freshman biology project and talked me into ordering one of those mail-in ancestry kits so he could build what he called an actual family tree instead of the 3 names I could give him. I remember hoping it wouldn't bring him more questions than answers. I had no idea it was about to bring an entire family back into our lives, or the shape that return would take. By the time Eli turned 15, I'd been promoted to clinical director of the pediatric hematology and oncology program at Ridgeline, running the unit where kids with leukemia and sickle cell disease and bone marrow failure spend the hardest year of their lives, and where their parents learn to read lab values the way other people read weather reports. It wasn't a fortune. It was a title earned over 11 years of night shifts and continuing education classes paid for on my own dime, on a program that, under my direction, cut its average time to donor identification by nearly a third, a number that means nothing to most people, and an entire extra chance at life to a family in the waiting room. Here's where the two halves of this story finally touch. 6 months before that afternoon, with 4 voicemails, a 6-year-old named Theo Fenwick, Holden's only son, was diagnosed with severe aplastic anemia, a disease where the bone marrow simply stops making blood cells, at a regional hospital 40 minutes from Millhaven. When local doctors couldn't stabilize him, they did what regional hospitals do with the hardest cases. They referred him to the best pediatric hematology program in the state. Mine. I didn't treat Theo directly, and for months I had no idea he was a patient in my own building, because Fenwick isn't a rare enough name to catch my eye in a hospital that treats 400 families a year. Marissa, his mother, sat through consult after consult for half a year, watching her son's blood counts fall before anyone connected the hospital's name to mine. It wasn't dramatic when it happened. It was a hallway. Marissa was leaving a meeting where she'd learned neither she nor Holden was a close enough match, and she passed a bulletin board outside the hematology conference room with a photo from a hospital fundraiser. Mine, 3 years old, captioned with my full name and title. She stood there almost a full minute before going home and asking Celeste a question she'd apparently been afraid to ask in 18 years. Wasn't there a daughter? Whatever happened to her? Around the same time, on a completely separate track, Warren Fenwick, 61, and increasingly aware of his own mortality the vague way men that age get, had quietly sent him one of those same ancestry kits himself, out of what he later told me was curiosity about his own father's side. Those companies will tell you when your DNA overlaps significantly with someone already in their system. 2 months before Theo's transplant team began widening their search beyond his parents, Warren got a notification that the company had flagged a new close relative, parent or child probable, a username he didn't recognize, that turned out 3 clicks later to belong to a 15-year-old with a profile photo of a kid grinning next to a half-built model rocket. I don't know exactly what Warren felt looking at that photo. I know what he told me weeks later, sitting across from me in a hospital conference room, that he sat in his truck in the Fenwick hardware lot for 45 minutes that afternoon and didn't go back inside. Theo's transplant team, once they learned there might be an extended paternal relative, ran the numbers on how rarely a half-sibling relationship produces a usable match, and were honest that the odds were low. But low isn't zero, and a family running out of options doesn't ignore low. They asked Warren if there was any way to reach the boy, and Warren, for the first time in 18 years, told Celeste no, this is not something we handle quietly, and called my office himself. I want to be accurate, because accuracy is the only thing I've ever really owed anyone. My father called first, not Celeste. She called 4 times after his one call went unanswered, because I didn't recognize his new number, and I let it ring out. I called him back that night, after Eli was asleep, alone at my own kitchen table, and listened to a man I hadn't spoken to in 15 years explain, haltingly, that his grandson, a boy he'd never met, might be the only match for another grandson he saw every week, and that he understood, he said this part twice, that he had no right to ask me anything at all. I'm going to pause the story right here for just a second. If you've ever had to hold an entire family's crisis in your hands while the same people who once treated you like a problem waited to see what you'd do, drop the word ready in the comments below. If you're new to this channel, subscribe now, because what I decided to do with that phone call is the part that changes everything before it. Okay, back to that kitchen table. I didn't say yes or no on that call. I told my father I needed 2 weeks, and that during those 2 weeks, nobody was to contact Eli directly for any reason. He agreed, so fast I understood exactly how frightened he was. I spent those 2 weeks doing what I do for a living, which is read a chart before I trust a single word anyone tells me about a patient. I called Theo's actual medical team, not his family, but as a colleague, and asked what the real odds were, the real timeline, what would actually be required of a 15-year-old, and what protections exist for a minor donor who's never met the family asking him for part of his own body. I learned every major transplant program assigns an independent donor advocate to any minor being considered, someone whose entire job is to represent the child's interests and nobody else's, with authority to stop the process if the child seems pressured. I made sure Theo's team already had one assigned before I said another word to my father. Then I called Lou, 71 now and still sharper than most people I know, and asked what she thought. She listened without interrupting, which for Lou is its own miracle, then said the only sentence I needed. That little boy didn't do anything to you. Help the boy. Just make sure, when it comes to the rest of them, you're the one who decides how this goes. I set the meeting for a Tuesday, at the hospital, in the conference room where I run monthly family council, because it's a room built for hard conversations, and a room where I've never once been the person without power in it. Eli would not be there, and would not be told anything existed until I'd assessed the situation myself. Lou sat in the hallway outside, not in the room, because I didn't need her to fight my battles anymore. I just needed to know she was there. They arrived 4 minutes early. Celeste had aged the way people age who spend a lifetime holding their face very still, fine lines set into permanent practice concern. She wore a cardigan the color of the inside of a church, and I understood before she said a word that she dressed for this the exact way she used to dress for parent-teacher conferences she intended to win. My father looked smaller than I remembered, the particular smallness of a man whose knees have started to go, hands that wouldn't stay still in his lap. Holden I hadn't seen since he was 17. 33 now, heavier through the shoulders, a hardware store owner's hands, and he wouldn't look at me for the first 10 minutes, which told me more about where he'd landed as a father than anything he'd eventually say out loud. Celeste opened first, because Celeste has never in her life let a silence sit longer than it took her to fill it with something reasonable sounding. Nora, she said, we know this is difficult, given everything, but we're hoping we can put the past where it belongs and focus on what matters, a little boy who needs help only your son can give him. I let that sentence sit a full 10 seconds before answering, because I've learned, delivering hard news to frightened families for 11 years, that the person who doesn't rush the silence is the person actually holding the room. I'm going to need you to be specific, I said, about where you think the past belongs. Because in my experience, Celeste, the past belongs exactly where it happened, on a porch, in the rain, with an envelope of cash and a note telling me it wasn't your problem to fix. My father flinched, an actual physical flinch, shoulders up toward his ears. Celeste's face did the thing I remember from childhood, the fast recalibration, cardigan sleeves smoothed over one wrist, chin lifted a half-inch. We were scared for the family's reputation, she said, and I'll own we handled it badly, but Nora, that was 16 years ago, and Theo is 6 right now, today, and he doesn't have 16 years to wait for us to litigate this. She wasn't wrong about the clock, and she knew it, and she was using it exactly the way she'd used the signing day banquet 16 years earlier, as a schedule that made my feelings the inconvenient variable. Some old, tired part of me almost let that work, the way it had worked my whole childhood. But I've spent 11 years in rooms where families are terrified and grieving, and still fully capable of manipulation, sometimes especially then, and I know a real emergency and a manufactured urgency can sound identical if you don't know what to listen for. Here's what I actually knew, sitting in that room, that none of them yet understood I knew. That Warren's match notification had sat unspoken for 2 months before anyone told me. That Celeste had asked Marissa, according to Marissa herself, whether there was a way to approach this quote unofficially, meaning without lawyers, meaning without me having any leverage at all. That the family currently asking me to set the past aside had spent my requested 2 weeks instead drafting, through a cousin who practiced family law 2 counties over, a document meant to establish, in Celeste's own words on a voicemail Marissa forwarded to me by mistake, quote, some reasonable boundaries around what Eli's mother can and can't ask for in exchange, unquote. I let them get a little further into their prepared version before I set a single printed page on the table. I didn't need 3 exhibits this time. I only needed 1. I have a call scheduled tomorrow morning with Theo's independent donor advocate. And with hospital legal, I said, not because I intend to make this difficult, but because Eli is a minor and any conversation about his body happens through the proper channel or it doesn't happen at all. I'm telling you this so you understand, before we go one sentence further, that there is no unofficial version available to you. There was never going to be a version where you ask a 15-year-old for bone marrow the same way you once asked a 19-year-old to disappear quietly. Celeste's face moved through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds, and none of them were the one she'd walked in wearing. What came through instead, just for a second, looked closer to fear, and I understood, watching it, that some part of her had genuinely believed she could run the exact same play twice. Handle it quietly, keep it off any official record, decide, alone, what was owed and to whom. It was Holden who finally spoke, and Holden who surprised me most that day. He'd been silent the whole meeting, hands flat on the table, and when he looked up his eyes were wet in a way that felt different from his mother's practiced dampness. Nora, he said, voice cracking on my actual name for maybe the first time in his life. I was 17. I didn't do anything, and I've had 6 months now watching my kid get sicker to think about what it means that I didn't do anything. I'm not asking you to forgive any of it. I'm asking you, one parent to another, please let us ask your son. Let him say no if he wants to say no. I'll live with whatever he says. I just can't live with never having asked. That was the first true sentence anyone from that family had spoken to me in 16 years, and it moved something in me that Celeste's whole rehearsed apology hadn't come near. Not because Holden deserved more credit than his mother. Because Holden, for once in his golden, favored life, had said something that cost him, out loud in front of her, instead of something that protected him. I told them what I'd already decided before they walked in, because I never let a family watch me think out loud about a diagnosis I haven't confirmed yet. I would tell Eli everything, I said. Not a version. Everything, including the porch, including the note, including 16 years of silence, because he's old enough to hold the truth, and he's earned the right to decide with the same information I have. If he says no, that conversation is over permanently, and none of you contact him again, for any reason. If he says yes, it happens entirely through the hospital's process, on his timeline, with his advocate. And Celeste, I said, looking at her directly for the first time that meeting, you do not get to tell this story to your church directory as a family reunion. If he does this, he does it for a 6-year-old he's never met. Not for you, and not for the version of his family you'd like people to believe you've always been. Celeste started to say something about how unfair that characterization was, and my father did something I'd never once seen him do in 18 years of living in her house. He put his hand on her arm, not gently, and said, Celeste, let her finish. Just this once, let her finish. I finished. I told them I'd call within the week with Eli's answer, and that the no contact stood until then. I stood up first, the way you do when a meeting is over whether or not everyone agrees it's over, and walked into the hallway where Lou sat exactly where I'd left her, reading a paperback she wasn't actually looking at. How'd it go? She asked. I told her I honestly didn't know yet. That's usually how the good ones go, she said, and we walked out together into a parking garage I know better than most rooms in my own apartment. I told Eli that Friday night, at our kitchen table, the same kind of table Lou once taught me to mix formula on. The whole thing, start to finish, the porch, the note, the $200, 15 years of silence, and then Theo, and the ancestry kit he talked me into buying for a school project 2 years earlier, the one that had somehow found its way back to the exact family I'd spent his whole life keeping at a careful distance. He was quiet a long time after I finished, turning his water glass in a slow circle on the table, the way I do when I need my hands to have a job while my brain catches up. Then he asked the only question that mattered to him, which had nothing to do with any of the adults in the story. He asked how sick Theo actually was, and what would happen to him if nobody was a match. I told him honestly, and my son, 15 years old, raised by a nurse and a retired charge nurse in a 2-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from the town that threw us both away, looked at me and said, "That's not his fault, though. None of that stuff you just told me is his fault. He's just a little kid." I told him he didn't know the Fenwicks anything, that saying no was a complete and acceptable answer, that I'd support whatever he decided with my whole chest either way. He looked at me the way he does when he thinks I'm underestimating him, which happens more now that he's 15. Mom, he said, I know I don't owe them anything. I want to do it for the kid, not for them. Can you make sure it stays that way? That sentence is, I think, the actual answer to everything I've told you tonight. 15 years of a green flannel blanket and kitchen table pharmacology exams, and a woman named Lou, who left her porch light on in the rain, had built a kid who could tell the difference between a person and the family circling that person, and choose the person every time. Everything Celeste ever tried to teach a child about which relatives count, my son had just quietly, completely rejected, at 15, in about 4 sentences, without raising his voice. The clinical testing confirmed what the ancestry kit had only guessed at. Eli was a genuine match, close enough that Theo's team called it, in the dry language doctors use when they're too professional to say lucky out loud, an excellent outcome profile. The donation happened 11 weeks later, through the hospital's process, with Eli's independent advocate present at every appointment, exactly as I'd required in that conference room. Eli met Theo twice before the procedure, both times with me and the advocate there, both times under 20 minutes, because a 6-year-old with a failing immune system doesn't need a family reunion. He needs a nap schedule and low stimulation, and I made sure everyone in that family understood the boy's actual medical needs came before anyone's emotional ones, including mine. I won't pretend the rest wrapped up the way a movie would, because it didn't, and I don't trust stories that do. Theo is doing well as of the night I'm recording this, engrafting on schedule, home from the hospital, back in first grade 3 days a week. Holden calls Eli every couple of weeks now. Careful, awkward calls, a 33-year-old man learning slowly how to actually be somebody's uncle. Eli takes the calls. He decides, every time, whether he wants to. I've never once told him he has to. My father sends a card now, on Eli's birthday, actual mail, to an address he apparently kept written down somewhere for years without using it. I don't know what to do with that yet. Some doors you leave cracked without walking through them. Celeste tried, 3 months after the transplant, to tell the story at a women's auxiliary luncheon as a tale of a family finding its way back to each other, according to Marissa, who called specifically to warn me before it happened, which tells you plenty about where Marissa's loyalties have quietly landed. I didn't call to correct the record. I didn't post anything. I've learned, the same way I learned it standing in a rainy driveway 16 years ago, that some reputations are built entirely on nobody in the room having the actual facts, and it only takes one person who was really there declining to clap along to end that particular trick. Enough people who'd heard the real version, from Marissa, from Holden, eventually from Warren himself, made sure the auxiliary version never fully took. As far as I know, Celeste hasn't tried telling it again. Here's what I've come to understand. Watching a family that spent 16 years deciding my son didn't count discover that his blood was the only thing standing between their golden grandchild and a hospital bed with no good ending. Blood was never the thing they actually valued. If it had been, Eli would have mattered the day he was born, not the day a lab report said he was useful. What they valued was convenience dressed up as family, right up until the convenience ran out and the only thing left standing between them and grief was a boy they'd once left on a porch in a rainstorm. I didn't help them because they finally deserved it. I helped a 6-year-old who never asked to be born into any of this, the same way nobody ever asked me to be born into it either. And I made sure, every step of the way, that my son got to decide what kind of person he wanted to be, instead of the family who once decided, without asking him a single question, what he was worth. So here's what I'll leave you with tonight. If the people who once told you that you weren't real family only came looking again once science proved they needed exactly what you had, would you help them? And if you did, would that make you the better person? Or would it simply prove, once and for all, that you never actually needed their approval to know who you always were? Tell me in the comments where you draw that line and why. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.